18 months after I buried my husband, I found my own obituary online. It had been published 3 weeks earlier on a memorial website I had never heard of. My full name. My date of birth. A photograph of me taken at Lucas's wedding 11 years ago, which I had posted once to a family account and not thought about since. A brief paragraph describing me as a beloved wife and mother who had passed peacefully at home in Connecticut following a period of declining health. The date of my listed death was 6 weeks ago. I was sitting at my kitchen table reading it on a Tuesday morning alive, drinking coffee that was still warm, watching a bird at the garden feeder through the window. Someone had declared me dead, and they had done it while I was still very much here. My name is Eleanor Brooks. I am 62 years old and I live in Connecticut. Thomas was my husband for 38 years. He died 18 months ago, or was declared to have died, and in the time since I have learned more about the life I was living than I ever expected to know. I did not expect to learn this. If this story stays with you, please subscribe and leave me a comment. Tell me what city you are watching from tonight. Now let me tell you who declared me dead. I found it by accident. That is the part that stays with me when I think about the sequence of events. Not the obituary itself, not the specific cruelty of seeing your own name on a memorial page, but the fact that I found it at all only because of a sequence of small coincidences that could easily have gone differently. A former colleague from my teaching years had sent me an email. She had seen something online that she thought might concern me. She phrased it carefully, the way people phrase things when they are not certain how to deliver information that might be upsetting, and she had attached a link. She said she was probably being overly cautious. She said it was likely nothing. She said she hoped I was well. I almost didn't open the link immediately. I had emails to respond to that morning. The ongoing correspondence with Patricia's office related to the civil recovery. A message from Ruth about the grief group. A note from Sophie about her landscape project. I set my colleague's email aside and worked through the others first, and came back to it 40 minutes later with a second cup of coffee and the particular unhurried attention of a woman who has learned not to rush toward difficult things. I clicked the link. The memorial page loaded. I read my own name. I read my own date of birth. I looked at my own face in a photograph from 11 years ago, younger, at Lucas's wedding, standing beside Thomas in the garden of the venue with the particular happiness of a woman who believes completely in the day she is standing in. I set the coffee cup down very carefully so it did not tip. Thomas had been a family law attorney for 35 years. I have thought about that fact many times in the 18 months since his death, not the fact itself, which I always knew, but the specific implications of it for everything I have since discovered. A family law attorney understands estate documents, financial instruments, and the legal architecture of a life better than almost anyone. He understands what can be changed, what can be forged, what can be backdated, and what requires witnesses and what doesn't. He also understands death certificates, and what a death certificate, filed in the right jurisdiction, at the right time, can unlock. I did not know, when I found the obituary, that there was also a death certificate. I found that out later. What I knew on that Tuesday morning was that someone had posted a memorial page for me on a website that aggregated obituaries from small regional newspapers and funeral home announcements and family-submitted memorials from across the country. The page had my name and my photograph and a paragraph describing my death in the particular language of memorial announcements: peaceful, beloved, a life well lived. It had been viewed 47 times. I sat at my kitchen table and thought about 47 people who had read that I was dead. I had spent 18 months reconstructing the truth of my marriage. The storage unit and the false passport. The second phone and the 11th voicemail. The wedding album in the box from the back of the study closet. The supplements on the bathroom counter and what they contained. The federal investigation and Gerald Whitmore and Lindsay, and the compound in Thomas's body and the verdict in a courtroom on a June morning. I had believed, by the time I booked the flight to Lisbon, that the reconstruction was complete. That I had accounted for everything Thomas had built, and everything he had intended, and everything that had been done in the service of those intentions. The obituary suggested I had been wrong. There was a layer I had not found yet. Something that had been set in motion by Thomas before his death, or by someone else after it, that I had not yet understood. Something that required the world to believe Eleanor Brooks was dead. Something for which my death, even a fabricated one, served a purpose. I thought about what purposes a dead woman's death might serve. A dead woman cannot contest a will. A dead woman cannot appear in court to challenge a financial claim. A dead woman cannot call her attorney and ask questions. A dead woman on paper in the right jurisdiction, with the right documentation, can have her assets transferred, her accounts closed, her identity dissolved into the legal category of the deceased. I picked up my phone. I called Patricia. Patricia answered on the first ring. I had learned, over 18 months of calls that began with "I found something," that Patricia Hale had developed a particular quality of readiness when my name appeared on her screen. Not alarm exactly. More like the focused stillness of a woman who has been through enough of these calls to understand that whatever comes next will require her complete attention. "There is a memorial page for me online," I said. "Published 3 weeks ago. My photograph, my date of birth, a paragraph describing my death 6 weeks ago. I am sending you the link now." A silence of approximately 4 seconds. "Forward it to Sandra immediately," Patricia said. "Don't close the page, don't share it, don't comment on it. I need Sandra to capture the full metadata before anyone has a chance to take it down." "All right. Who else has seen it?" "A former colleague sent me the link this morning. She found it, I don't know how. 47 page views according to the counter. Do you know any of those 47 people?" "No way to know." "All right." The sound of Patricia moving, of her office reorganizing itself around a new priority. "I'm calling Sandra now. Come in this afternoon. 2 o'clock. "Patricia," I said. "Is there a death certificate?" A pause that was slightly longer than her previous pauses. "That is one of the first things we are going to find out," she said carefully. Which was not a no. Sandra had the metadata within 2 hours. The memorial page had been created using an account registered to an email address that did not correspond to any real person, a constructed identity, a temporary address used once and then abandoned, the digital equivalent of a note left unsigned. The IP address from which the page had been created traced to a public library in a suburb of Hartford, Connecticut. 31 minutes from my house on Birchwood Lane, which I had sold 8 months ago and from which I had been moved out for 7. Someone local had created the page. Someone who knew my name, my date of birth, my photograph, my connection to Connecticut. Someone who had enough information to construct a convincing memorial, but had been careful enough not to create it from a traceable location. The photograph, I said. It's from Lucas's wedding. 11 years ago. I posted it once to a family account. Sandra looked at her notes. The family account, who had access? I thought about it. Thomas had the login. Lucas had the login. Lindsay had been given access at some point in the early years of her marriage to Lucas, to share photographs of the grandchildren. Lindsay was in a correctional facility serving a 32-year sentence. She had access to limited supervised communications. She had an attorney. She had, according to the information Patricia's office had gathered through the civil proceedings, a small number of people who visited or corresponded with her regularly. Lindsay, I said. Sandra and Patricia exchanged a look. It's possible, Patricia said carefully. It is also possible that someone acting on her behalf, or on behalf of interests connected to her, created the page. We don't know yet. What would the purpose be? I said. At this point, the conviction is complete. The sentencing is done. What does a fake obituary accomplish now? Patricia set her pen down on the legal pad. That, she said, is the question we need to answer before we understand what we are actually dealing with. Agent Torres came to Patricia's office the following morning. She had been informed overnight and had spent, by her own account, most of those hours making calls to people whose job it was to know things that were not publicly accessible. She arrived at 9 with a folder and the particular expression of an investigator who has found something she did not expect to find and is now working out how to present it. She sat across from me at the conference table. She opened the folder. There is a death certificate, she said. I had known it was coming. I had known it from the pause in Patricia's voice on the phone the previous morning. I still felt the words land with a weight that required a moment of stillness before I could respond. Filed where? Patricia said. A county clerk's office in western Massachusetts, Agent Torres said. 6 weeks ago. The same county where Thomas's first marriage, the marriage to Vivian, was recorded in 1988. I looked at her. The same county, I said. Yes. The filing used documentation that appears, on initial examination, to be professional in quality. A death certificate in your name, listing cause of death as cardiac complications following a period of declining health. Declining health. The same language that had appeared in the memorial page paragraph. The same framing Thomas had been building with the supplements, with the notebook of documented symptoms, with the appointments he had accompanied me to and the questions he had answered on my behalf while I struggled to concentrate. He had been building the documentation for this. Not just for the power of attorney. For a death certificate. He planned to kill me, I said. The room was very quiet. Agent Torres met my eyes directly. Based on what we are seeing, the documented cognitive decline, the power of attorney, and now a death certificate filed in a jurisdiction with which he had a prior relationship, it appears the original plan had two phases. Phase 1 was incapacitation sufficient to transfer control of your assets. Phase 2, she paused. Phase 2 would have required your actual death, or a sufficiently documented version of it, to complete the asset transfer permanently. He was going to disappear to Lisbon, I said. And I was going to die. That appears to have been the intention, yes. Whether he intended to accelerate the process once he reached Lisbon, or allow the compound to do its work over a longer timeline, we don't know. What we know is that the death certificate was prepared in advance. It was waiting. I thought about Thomas at the kitchen table, patient and methodical, translating legal language into terms I could follow on a day when following anything was difficult. The papers I had signed. The power of attorney. The estate restructuring. All of it building toward a document filed in a county clerk's office in Western Massachusetts 6 weeks ago. Who filed it? Patricia said. Thomas is dead. He couldn't have filed it himself. Agent Torres looked at her folder. No, she said. He couldn't have. The name on the filing documentation was one I had not encountered before. A man named Paul Garrett, 44 years old. A paralegal who had worked, until 8 months ago, at a small firm in Springfield, Massachusetts, the same city where Thomas and Vivian had maintained their apartment in the late 80s and early 90s. He had left the firm under circumstances that the firm's managing partner described to Agent Torres as mutually agreed upon and declined to elaborate on, which Agent Torres said was the professional language of a situation that had not ended cleanly. Sandra found the connection within 48 hours. Paul Garrett had worked at the firm that handled Thomas's child support arrangement for Sophie. The firm where Robert Calloway, Ruth's late husband, had been a partner. Garrett had been a junior paralegal there for 11 years, working under Robert Calloway's supervision until Calloway's death 4 years ago. He had known about Thomas for years through Robert Calloway's files. When Robert Calloway died, those files had not been transferred or destroyed according to standard protocol. They had remained in a cabinet in an office that was subsequently occupied by a different attorney who had not fully inventoried the inherited materials. Paul Garrett had had access to those files, and someone had recently paid him a significant amount of money to use what was in them. Agent Torres placed a bank statement on the table. A wire transfer to Paul Garrett's personal account. Made 8 weeks ago, 2 weeks before the death certificate was filed. She pointed to the originating account. I looked at the account number. At the name attached to it. The account was held in the name of a woman I had not previously encountered in any of our investigations. A name I did not recognize. But the account had been opened, according to the record Sandra had obtained, with an initial deposit that traced, through 2 intermediary transfers, to an account I did recognize. An account connected to Lindsay. Not directly. Not in a way that was simple or obvious, or that could have been found without the patience of an investigator who had been working this case for over a year. But connected, through the careful architecture of someone who had been planning from a correctional facility, using the supervised communications available to her and the resources of people who were willing to act on her behalf. She's been running this from prison, I said. She had 18 months to plan it, Agent Torres said. and resources we didn't fully account for when we assessed her situation after sentencing. We knew about her attorney. We knew about her regular visitors. What we didn't know about was a third party she had been communicating with through her attorney's office, a communication channel that is technically privileged and therefore not subject to monitoring. Her attorney helped her? Patricia said. Her attorney communicated messages. Whether the attorney understood the full nature of what was being communicated is a matter we are currently investigating and are not in a position to discuss further. Agent Torres closed the folder. What I can tell you is that we have enough to bring additional charges. Conspiracy to commit fraud. Filing false government documents. And depending on what we establish about the intended endpoint of the plan, she looked at me directly. Conspiracy to commit murder. The last 3 words settled into the room with the particular weight of words that have been waiting to be said. I looked at the table in front of me. 18 months. The storage unit and the voicemail, and the wedding album, and the supplements, and the trial, and Lisbon, and the garden coming back, and the tulips I had not planted. And still there was another layer. A death certificate filed in Western Massachusetts with my name on it, and a cause of death that described a decline that had been manufactured by the man who claimed to love me, and maintained by the woman who had sat at my table and called me family. I looked at Agent Torres. What do you need from me? I said. Your testimony, she said. Again. And your patience while we build the case completely before we move. How long? 6 weeks. Possibly 8. I nodded. All right, I said. I'll be here. I looked at Patricia. She was already writing. The 6 weeks were not quiet. They were quiet on the surface. I went to the garden in the mornings. I spoke to Lucas on Sundays. I exchanged messages with Ruth and Sophie and Catherine. I read books I could now actually follow because the compound was fully metabolized and my mind was entirely my own again in a way I had not fully appreciated until I had experienced the alternative. But underneath the surface, the investigation was moving with the focused momentum of something that has been building for a long time and has finally found solid ground to build on. Agent Torres's team traced the full chain of communication between Lindsay and Paul Garrett. It had run, as she had described, through Lindsay's attorney's office, not through the attorney herself, who was ultimately cleared of knowing involvement, but through a legal assistant in the office who had been passing messages in both directions in exchange for payments that were, Agent Torres said, significantly less than the risk they represented. The legal assistant cooperated immediately when approached. She was 26 years old and had understood herself to be facilitating communication about Lindsay's appeal rather than about an active conspiracy. When she learned the full nature of what she had been transmitting, she was, Agent Torres said, genuinely horrified in a way that was consistent with someone who had not understood what they were participating in. She was not charged. She testified. Paul Garrett did not cooperate immediately. He retained an attorney, a different attorney from the one who had connected him to the scheme, and spent 2 weeks maintaining that he had filed the death certificate in good faith based on documentation provided to him by what he understood to be the estate of Thomas Brooks. He said he had been told Eleanor Brooks had died and that he was simply formalizing existing documentation. Agent Torres said this was the defense of a man who understood he was in serious difficulty and was trying to construct a version of events in which he was merely careless rather than criminally complicit. The bank transfers made carelessness difficult to sustain as an explanation. He cooperated in week 3. Paul Garrett's cooperation produced something none of us had anticipated. Not because what he revealed was more complex than what we already knew. By this point the architecture of Thomas's planning and Lindsay's continuation of it had been mapped with enough thoroughness that very little surprised me in its structure. What Paul Garrett revealed was simpler than complexity. It was a document. A single document that Thomas had prepared and given to Robert Calloway, Ruth's late husband, for safekeeping 11 years ago. A document that Robert Calloway had stored in the files that Paul Garrett had subsequently accessed. A document that Lindsay had discovered existed through her communications with Garrett, and had instructed him to use as the basis for the death certificate filing. Agent Torres placed it on the conference table. It was a sworn affidavit, prepared by Thomas, dated 11 years ago, notarized by a notary whose stamp I recognized as belonging to a woman who had worked in Thomas's firm for 2 decades. The affidavit stated that Eleanor and Brooks, wife of Thomas Allen Brooks, had expressed to her husband on multiple occasions a wish to be declared legally deceased in the event of extended cognitive incapacitation, and had authorized him to take whatever legal steps were necessary to formalize that declaration if in his professional judgment the threshold of incapacitation had been met. I stared at the document for a long time. My name. My supposed wishes. A notary stamp from a woman who had worked in my husband's office. I never signed this, I said. We know, Agent Torres said. The signature is a forgery. The notarization was obtained fraudulently. We spoke with the notary, who has no recollection of this document, and whose stamp was apparently used without her knowledge. She is cooperating fully. He prepared this 11 years ago, I said. Yes. 11 years ago I had been 51 years old. Lucas had just had his first child. Thomas and I had celebrated our 29th anniversary at the restaurant where we had gone on our second date. He had held my hand across the table. 11 years ago he had prepared a document authorizing my legal death. I looked at Patricia. She was looking at the document with the expression of a lawyer who has seen a great deal, and is still capable of being affected by specific things. This is what Lindsay was building toward, Patricia said quietly. The death certificate needed a legal basis. Without this affidavit it was simply a forged document. With it, in the right jurisdiction, presented to the right clerk, it becomes a contested legal instrument that could take months or years to fully invalidate. Meaning my assets, I said. Meaning the assets that were not recovered in the civil proceedings. The accounts that were beyond the statute of limitations. The portions of the estate that remained in legal ambiguity. Patricia looked at me. If you were legally declared dead and the declaration stood long enough to be acted on, certain transfers could be executed that would be extremely difficult to reverse. How much? I said. Patricia named a number. It was not the largest number I had heard in 18 months of sitting in this conference room. But it was significant. Significant enough to explain 18 months of planning from a correctional facility. Significant enough to explain Paul Garrett and the library in Hartford and the memorial page with 47 views. She's been sitting in prison planning this for 1.5 years, I said. Yes, Agent Torres said. While Lucas was rebuilding. While the grandchildren were adjusting. While I was in Lisbon. I looked at the affidavit on the table. At my forged signature. At the notary's stamp obtained without knowledge or consent. She was planning to make me disappear on paper. Yes, Agent Torres said again. I sat with that for a moment. Then I said, "What do you need to stop it completely?" Agent Torres needed 3 things. The first was my formal statement confirming that the signature on the affidavit was not mine, and that I had never expressed any such wish to Thomas or to anyone else. I gave that statement the same afternoon, in the precise, careful language of someone who has given formal statements before and understands that precision matters more than emphasis. The second was testimony from the notary, which had already been secured and which established that the stamp had been used fraudulently and that the notary had no knowledge of or involvement in the document's preparation. The third was the cooperation of a woman named Diane Ashworth. I had not heard that name before Agent Torres said it. Diane Ashworth was 63 years old. She lived in Springfield, Massachusetts. She had worked as a paralegal at Robert Calloway's firm for 22 years, retiring 2 years before Calloway's death. She had been present, she told Agent Torres, when Thomas had come to the firm to have the affidavit prepared and notarized. She had witnessed the interaction between Thomas and the notary. She had understood at the time that something about the visit was unusual. The notary had seemed uncertain, had left the room twice, had returned looking like a woman who had been persuaded of something she was not entirely comfortable with, but had not had sufficient grounds to object or report it. She had carried that memory for 11 years. When Agent Torres contacted her, she had agreed to a conversation immediately. She said she had been waiting for someone to ask. I asked Patricia if I could speak with Diane Ashworth directly. Patricia considered it for a moment. "It's unusual," she said. "I know. I'd still like to." She arranged it for the following afternoon. A video call, with Patricia present, with Agent Torres informed and not objecting. Diane Ashworth appeared on the screen as a woman who looked like someone who had been carrying something for a long time and was relieved to be setting it down. Gray hair, practical glasses, the direct gaze of a paralegal who has spent 22 years dealing in facts. "Mrs. Brooks," she said, "I'm glad you're alive." It was such a simple thing to say. So direct. So entirely without the careful professional framing that everyone else in my life had learned to use around the events of the past 18 months. I found it immediately steadying. "Thank you," I said, "for speaking with Agent Torres. And for remembering." "I've thought about that afternoon many times," she said. "I didn't know what I was witnessing exactly. But I knew something was wrong. The notary, she was a young woman, she was new, she seemed to not know how to say no to him. He was very certain, very practiced, like a man who had done this kind of thing before." "He had," I said. She nodded slowly. "I'm sorry," she said, "for not saying something at the time. I've wondered since whether it would have changed anything. I thought about that honestly." "Perhaps not," I said. "Thomas was very good at building things that were difficult to dismantle. But it might have changed the timeline. And timelines matter." She was quiet for a moment. "He came to the office alone," she said. "No client. No accompanying counsel. Just him, with a folder of documents that he had clearly prepared himself. The notary stamped what he put in front of her and he left, and I never saw him again. A pause. I looked him up once, a few years later. Found the firm in Connecticut. Seemed like an ordinary family law practice. She looked at me through the screen. I had no idea. None of us did, I said. That was the point. The additional charges were filed on a Tuesday morning. Lindsay faced new counts of conspiracy to file false government documents, conspiracy to commit fraud, and based on the evidence connecting the plan's endpoint to the financial transfers that would have been executed on a legally dead woman's accounts. Conspiracy with intent. Paul Garrett was charged with filing false government documents and receiving proceeds of fraud. He had cooperated and his attorney was negotiating the terms of that cooperation. Agent Torres said he would likely serve time regardless of the cooperation. The document he had filed was not a minor clerical error. It was a death certificate for a living woman, obtained through a forged affidavit and a misused notary stamp, in service of a financial scheme. The legal assistant from Lindsay's attorney's office was given immunity in exchange for her complete testimony. Lindsay's attorney, the one through whose office the messages had passed, resigned from the case the day after the charges were filed. I did not attend the filing. I was in the garden when Patricia called to confirm it had happened. I was dividing a clump of ornamental grass that had grown too large for its corner of the bed, the kind of work that requires both hands and a certain amount of force, and is completely absorbing in the way of physical tasks that have a clear beginning, middle, and end. I set down the garden fork. I listened to Patricia. I said thank you. I picked up the garden fork and went back to work. Some things you celebrate. Some things you simply acknowledge and continue. I had learned, over 18 months, to know the difference. The second trial was shorter than the first. 11 days the first time. 6 days the second. Not because the case was simpler, it was in some ways more complex, involving jurisdictions and document chains and financial instruments that required careful expert testimony to make legible to a jury. But because the evidence was cleaner, Paul Garrett had cooperated completely. The legal assistant had cooperated completely. The notary had cooperated completely. And Lindsay, facing charges that added significantly to a sentence she was already serving, had no viable path that did not run directly through the facts. Her attorney, a new one, the third she had retained since her arrest, made the argument that had become, by this point, familiar. Lindsay had been manipulated. Lindsay had been deceived. Lindsay had believed, based on information provided to her by Thomas, that Eleanor Brooks was already in cognitive decline, and that the legal formalization of that decline was a merciful rather than a criminal act. The jury deliberated for 1 day. Guilty on all counts. The judge at sentencing noted that the original conviction already reflected the severity of Lindsay's actions. The additional charges, he said, reflected something beyond severity. They reflected persistence. A woman who had committed murder, been convicted, been sentenced, and had then spent 18 months in a correctional facility continuing to plan, continuing to reach, continuing to attempt to complete a scheme whose original architect was dead. He added 14 years to her existing sentence. Lindsay was 51 years old. She would be eligible for parole review at 87. I was in the courtroom for the sentencing. I had been there for 2 days of the trial as well, not all 6, but 2. Enough to be present. Enough to have earned the right to be in the room when the number was said. When the judge finished speaking, I looked at Lindsay across the courtroom. She did not look at me. She had not looked at me once during either trial. Not during my testimony, not during the verdict, not during the sentencing. She kept her eyes on the table in front of her or on her attorney or on a point slightly above and to the left of wherever I was sitting, a studied avoidance that required effort and that therefore was, I understood, a choice. I did not need her to look at me. I already had everything I needed from that courtroom. Paul Garrett was sentenced 3 weeks later. For years, with eligibility for early release after 2 given his cooperation and the absence of prior criminal history. His attorney had argued that he was a man of limited means who had been presented with a significant financial opportunity and had not fully understood the nature of what he was participating in. The judge found this partially credible and partially not, which the sentence reflected. I did not attend Paul Garrett's sentencing. I had not met him in person and felt no particular need to be present for the legal conclusion of his involvement. He was a peripheral figure, significant in the specific damage he had caused, but peripheral in the larger story. A man who had known too much through Robert Calloway's files and had made a choice about what to do with that knowledge when someone offered him enough money. He had made the wrong choice. He would have time to consider that. I sent Diane Ashworth a note after the Garrett sentencing. A brief one, handwritten, thanking her for coming forward and telling her that her testimony had mattered. She wrote back within the week a longer letter, in the careful, precise handwriting of a woman who takes correspondence seriously. She said she had felt for 11 years that she had failed to act when she should have. She said the testimony had not erased that feeling entirely, but had reduced it to something she could live alongside. She said she hoped I was well. I wrote back. I told her I was. It was true. Lucas came for dinner the Sunday after the second sentencing. He brought the grandchildren, as he always did, and they went immediately to the garden with the focused urgency of children who have specific things they want to check on: the progress of the tulips, the status of the bird feeder, the clump of ornamental grass I had divided and replanted in 2 locations, and which one of them had decided to monitor weekly for signs of recovery. Lucas and I sat at the kitchen table while they investigated the garden. He had known about the second case from the beginning. I had told him the morning after I found the obituary, because he was my son, and because the days of managing information carefully to protect him were behind us. He had received it the way he received everything now, directly, with the particular stillness of a man who has been through enough that nothing arrives as a complete surprise anymore, only as a new iteration of something whose shape he already knows. It's done now, he said. Not a question. Yes, I said. This part is done. He looked at his coffee cup. Is there always going to be another part? He said. Not with bitterness. With genuine curiosity, the question of a man trying to calibrate his expectations for the future. I thought about it honestly. I don't know, I said. I used to think there would always be another layer. Now I think we have found the bottom of it. But I thought that before. He nodded. So we stay alert, he said. We stay alert, I said. And we also live. The two things are not mutually exclusive. He looked out the kitchen window at his children in the garden. The younger one had found the garden fork I had left leaning against the fence and was attempting to use it on a patch of soil with the earnest inefficiency of a 5-year-old who has decided to help without being asked. Lucas watched for a moment. Then he got up and went out to assist. I stayed at the kitchen table and watched through the window as my son crouched beside his child and showed him how to hold the fork properly, how to press it into the earth with the right amount of force, how to turn the soil without making a mess of it. The child listened with the serious attention of someone learning something important. The garden received them both. Ruth drove down from Providence the following weekend. She brought food, as she always did, and the particular quality of company that requires nothing, no performance, no careful management of how you are presenting yourself, no translation of your actual state into a more acceptable version of it. Ruth had earned the right to see me as I actually was through 18 months of phone calls and text messages, and the shared experience of having loved the same man in entirely different versions of what that love was. We sat in the garden in the particular warmth of a late afternoon that had not yet committed to evening. She asked me how I felt now that the second case was concluded. I told her something I had not yet fully articulated to anyone else. Lighter, I said. Not because justice makes things light. I've learned that it doesn't, not exactly. But because there is nothing left to find. No more layers. No more documents in boxes I haven't opened. No more phone calls from Patricia saying she needs me to come in. The story is complete. And there is something not comfortable exactly, but solid about a story that is complete. Ruth was quiet for a moment. Do you think he knew, she said, when he was planning all of it? Do you think he understood what he was building toward? Yes, I said. I think he understood exactly. He was a precise man. He didn't build imprecise things. Does that make it worse, she said. That it was deliberate all the way through? I had asked myself that question many times. It makes it clearer, I said. Which is different from worse. Worse is a feeling. Clearer is a fact. I have found that I can live more easily inside facts than inside feelings at this point. Ruth considered this. That might be the most Eleanor Brooks thing you have ever said, she said. I looked at her. She was almost smiling. After a moment I was almost smiling too. We sat together in the garden as the afternoon moved toward evening, two women in their 60s who had found each other at the bottom of something they had not expected to survive and had discovered, in the finding, that survival was not the ceiling of what was possible. It was simply the floor. Everything above it was still to be determined. The memorial page came down the week after the second sentencing. Agent Torres had it removed through the website's legal compliance process, which took 7 days and required documentation I had become practiced at assembling. The death certificate filed in Western Massachusetts was formally invalidated by the county clerk's office upon receipt of the court order Patricia obtained the same week. Eleanor and Brooks, according to every legal record that existed, was alive. I had always known this. It was, nonetheless, satisfying to have the paperwork confirm it. It is October now. The garden has gone quiet in the particular way of October gardens, not dead, not finished, but retreated, drawing inward. doing the invisible work of preparation that will produce, in April, things I am not yet able to see. I have learned enough about gardens in the past year to understand that the quiet months are not empty months. They are the months when the work that matters most is happening underground, out of sight, in the dark. I find that comforting in ways I did not anticipate when I started gardening. I did not start gardening because I thought it would teach me things. I started because the new house had a garden and I had time, and I needed something that required my hands. What it has taught me has arrived without announcement, the way the best lessons do, not in the form of insight, but in the form of changed perception, a gradual shift in how I see things that I only notice when I look back at how I used to see them. I used to believe that survival was the goal. I no longer believe that. Survival is the beginning. What comes after it is the actual work. Lucas called last night. He had been to see a lawyer, not Patricia, a different one, someone who specializes in the particular legal questions that arise when a family's financial history has been as thoroughly complicated as ours. He is working on establishing a trust for the grandchildren. Something clean and clear and documented in language that leaves no room for interpretation. He said he had read every line of every document before signing anything. He said it twice. He wanted me to know he had done this. I told him I was glad. He said Sophie had called him earlier in the week. That they had talked for an hour about things that had nothing to do with Thomas or Lindsay or any of the events of the past 18 months. That they had talked about his children and her project and a film they had both seen and a restaurant in Portland she was recommending and whether he might bring the grandchildren to visit in the spring. He said it had felt, for an hour, like talking to someone he had known for years. I told him that was because he had, in the way that mattered. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Mom, thank you for finding her." I looked at the garden through the kitchen window, at the October quiet of it. "You're welcome," I said. I meant it completely. There is a woman I think about sometimes. Not Lindsay. Not Vivian or Catherine or Ruth or Margaret or any of the women whose lives intersected with Thomas's in the ways I have now fully mapped. A different woman. The one who came to Vivian's apartment 35 years ago, when Sophie was 18 months old, and told Vivian the truth about Thomas and then left. I don't know who she was. I may never know. She appeared once in the record of these events, in a single sentence from Vivian relayed through Sophie, and then disappeared back into whatever life she had been living before and after that afternoon. She was a woman who knew something and chose to say it directly, and then stepped back and let the truth do what truth does. I have thought about what it cost her to do that. What she risked. What she gained, which was probably nothing tangible. She did it anyway. I don't know her name, but she is part of this story. She has always been part of it. Someone left a comment on one of my earlier videos last week. She said she had been married for 26 years to a man she had trusted completely. She said she had recently found something, she did not say what, that had reorganized everything she believed about her life. She said she did not know what to do next. She asked if it got easier. I sat with her question for a long time before I answered. Here is what I said to her, and what I want to say to anyone watching this who is somewhere inside their own version of what I have been through. It does not get easier in the way you are hoping for when you ask that question. The specific weight of a specific betrayal does not lighten on a schedule. It does not respond to time the way ordinary grief responds to time. It is more stubborn than that, and more personal and more resistant to the comfort of general wisdom. What changes is not the weight. What changes is your capacity to carry it while also carrying other things. You become, without noticing it happening, a woman who can hold the knowledge of what was done to her in one hand and the fact of her own continuing life in the other, and walk forward with both. That is not the same as healing. I am not certain healing is the right word for what happens after the kind of betrayal I have described in these stories. What happens is more like integration. The experience becomes part of you rather than the whole of you. It takes up its appropriate portion of the available space and leaves room for everything else. The tulips came up in April. I did not plant them. In October the garden is quiet and doing its invisible work. In April there will be tulips again. That is not a metaphor. It is simply what gardens do. But it is also, if you need it to be, something more than that. I am 62 years old. Someone filed a death certificate with my name on it. Someone published my obituary while I was sitting at my kitchen table drinking warm coffee, watching a bird at the garden feeder. I am still here. I am still watching the bird. That is the whole story. Leave me a comment and tell me where you are watching from. Tell me if you have ever had someone try to write your ending before you were finished. Tell me what you did with the pen. I read every single one.